Hello and welcome to the Pathways to Results or PTR series of webinars. This is the second webinar in this series of 3 and I will be covering the Equity and Outcomes Assessment. As stated in the last webinar, OCCRL's researchers study policies, programs, and practices designed to enhance outcomes for diverse youth and adults who seek to transition to and through college to employment. There are 5 core processes in the PTR model. As previously stated, today I will cover the Equity and Outcomes Assessment, which is a foundational component of the PTR model. Before you start the Equity and Outcomes Assessment, your team should have an extensive conversation around equity and its role within the PTR process, your PTR project, and your PTR team as a whole. This conversation around equity should have been held with the core PTR team and partners you identified. Finally, you should have drafted a charter to help guide your PTR team moving forward. The first step of the Equity and Outcomes Assessment is to identify, collect, and interpret disaggregated data. During the PTR process, we deeply stress the disaggregation of student data in order to truly understand where equity gaps lie. Your data should be disaggregated based on different social identity groups. Example given: race, class, gender, age, ability status, veteran students, and single parents, to name a few. The second step is to use PTR equity concepts to analyze student data and identify the equity gaps. And the third step is to understand the equity gaps and what the problem is that students are facing in your program. Again, the driving force of understanding the equity gaps is disaggregating your data. And as always, you will end this assessment with a period of review and reflection. There are major inequities across race at Illinois community colleges. Graduation rates at two-year colleges include students who earned either an associate's degree or another degree or certificate that can be completed in 2 years or less. It is important to note that completion does not include transfers who go on to graduate at other institutions. Low-income students are less likely to complete a degree. As you can see on your screen, low-income students complete at a rate of 37%, whereas their wealthier peers finish at 75%. If you watched the first webinar, this photo will be familiar to you, and I will briefly cover it here. Applying an equity lens does not mean treating all students or individuals in the same way. Equity in this context means investing resources and designing programs that address the needs of students with different experiences and educational backgrounds. Targeted investment and program design should produce equal outcomes, the ultimate goal of an equity-minded process. If all of the runners started from the same line, then the athletes in the outer lanes would have to run further than the athletes in the inner lanes because of the semicircles at the top and the bottom of the track. So each lane has to have a special starting position so they all have to run the same distance. So while it may appear that the yellow and red runners are getting a head start, they are actually being placed in the correct positions on the track in order to run the same distance as the blue runner. We need to make sure that students from historically marginalized populations gain the starting places that best support their needs in order to make sure they run the same distance as students that come from historically privileged backgrounds. The key is getting every student group what they need in order to be successful. Low-income students at community colleges within the state of Illinois are completing at 37%, whereas their wealthier counterparts are completing at 75%. This is an enormous equity gap that can have devastating effects for students that are low income. We need to ensure that the 37% of students in the low income bracket receive the proper starting position at Illinois community colleges so their completion percentages begin to rise. Deficit thinking attributes student outcomes solely on students and their respective backgrounds and experiences. Whereas students have a responsibility when it comes to their education and must be held accountable, there is irrefutable evidence that suggests students, more specifically traditionally marginalized, underrepresented, and underserved students, experience many barriers to success throughout their educational careers. Anti-deficit equity-mindedness focuses on institutional responsibility, meeting the students where they are, assessing policies, practices, and processes for barriers, and checking biases for improving outcomes of students. This illustration is not intended to suggest that institutions are to blame. It is, however, intended to encourage PTR team members to think about student strengths and needs to assess the role of institutions and institutional agents in student outcomes. With PTR, we see equity-mindedness as practitioners becoming aware of institutional inequities and taking responsibility for reducing educational opportunity gaps while striving for equity and parity in outcomes. This approach is based in equity-mindedness, which counteracts the tendency to explain equity gaps solely as the result of student deficits. Rather, what we as institutional agents can do better to support their success. As this example illustrates, deficit statements attribute equity gaps to students and what they are or are not doing to close the gap. The institutional responsibility inquiry column looks introspectively into the institution to question what they are or are not doing to best support the success of students. On your screen, you will see a problem statement exercise. We encourage you to pause the video and complete the exercise with your PTR team. Please be sure to discuss what is deficit-minded about these statements before rewriting the equity-minded statements. Please note that review and reflection occurs on an ongoing basis. For this module, your team will spend time reviewing and reflecting over the impact of disaggregated data. In terms of what's next, please revisit the PTR charter to describe the equity gap that was identified through analysis of data in form of the problem statement and the problem description. In the next webinar, we will go over the process and practice assessment. As always, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to the Office of Community College Research and Leadership. Thank you.